by applause, because I can't really see you, how many people have been here before? Excellent. How many folks are joining us for the first time? A few. Well, welcome, and we hope to see you here many, many more times in the future. Before I say anything else, I am going to give a land acknowledgement. ASU and ASU Kerr acknowledge the 22 Native nations that have inhabited this land for centuries. Arizona State University's 4 campuses and ASU Kerr are located in the Salt River Valley on ancestral territories of indigenous peoples, including the Acamil O'odham and Peepash Indian communities, whose care and keeping of these lands allow us to be here today. We acknowledge the sovereignty of these nations and seek to foster an environment of success and possibility for Native American patrons and communities. ASU Kerr has been working on new outreach and awareness efforts and upgrades to this venue that are truly an expression of its hip and historical energy. How many folks know that our new motto is "Where hip meets historical"? All good. Spread the word. And please feel free to pick up a brochure that announces that we are where hip meets historical. And absolutely none of these improvements and new promotional opportunities would be possible without the very crucial and truly transformative financial support and passion for the arts of the Abbott Family Foundation and other key donors. If you'd like to know how to join our small but growing VIP club, please stop by the box office after your visit to get information from Monica, and she would be happy to help you out. I definitely want to make sure that you know where things are. You can see the exit signs that are lit up, and the restrooms are behind you to my left, and will be straight ahead when you head that direction. What else can I tell you? We, of course, need to, let's give a big round of applause to Renegade Coffee Company for the delicious coffee and coffee cake. Before I acknowledge and welcome our sponsor, I do want to let you know we do have some other shows coming up at ASU Kerr. We have Gather, which is a storytelling event, Wyatt Earp, which is the life of Wyatt Earp, and also Shauna Boussard on April 2nd will be doing Fancy Meeting You Here, a celebration of Rosemary Clooney and Bing Crosby, which should be a lot of fun. Okay, and now it is time. You're all here to hear about a great event, the Magic Flute, right? Yes. Okay, let me introduce from the fabulous Arizona Opera Company, which I hope you support, Dr. Miriam Schildkret.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for braving the rain and coming out on this beautiful rainy morning. So happy to have you all here. My name is Miriam. I was here last month speaking with you all about the sound of music and about music theater. Oh, thank you. How many of you were able to see the production? Oh my goodness, yay! Well, I hope you enjoyed it and had a fabulous time. It was absolutely beautiful and such a pleasure to be a part of. And I am so thrilled today to be talking about one of my absolute favorite operas of all time, one of my favorite composers of all time, The Magic Flute by Mozart. If you've never seen this opera, this is a wonderful first opera, and we're so excited to be joined by Jen and by Veronique, who was singing Liesel in Sound of Music, and you'll get to hear her sing something completely different today when she sings Pamina, and she will be in the main stage production as well. So, like I said last month, I love to go broad and then get more specific. So last time we were talking a lot about music theater, how that's different from opera. So today we're focusing a lot more on opera and on its history. So you all have some context for what we're talking about when I talk more about Mozart and the Magic Flute. So this opera and all Mozart's operas and works take place during the classical period. And I know that's a little confusing because opera is classical music, the big genre that we call classical music, but this is during a specific time period known as the classical era. This also was the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 18th century or 1700s, and this was a time that really valued rational thought, thinking, balance. There were a lot of advancements in mathematics and science during this time period. And for those of you who are visual, I wanted to include a piece of art from this time period. This is the Oath of the Horatii by David, which was in 1784 that this was painted. And this gives a really great visual representation of what artists were doing during the Age of Enlightenment. This is just a cool tidbit that I love about history and about people, is that we as humans express art. So what's happening in the opera world or the theater world or the art world all tends to intersect based on what's happening in the world in general. So when I was in college, I was taking art history classes, 20th century art history, at the same time that I was taking 20th century music theory, and it was fascinating how similar those two things were. In fact, I learned that Schoenberg and Kandinsky were really good friends and would talk about their theories about how, for Kandinsky, how to do art that didn't represent people or things, instead to have shapes and have it really be emotion, and how Schoenberg had similar thoughts on how music could not be representative by going atonal or going 12-tone. So looking at this piece of art, you see it's not unemotional by any means. There's a lot of emotion happening. We have the courage and strength of these soldiers compared to the sadness and mourning that the women are experiencing, and also these geometric patterns that you can see, how things are framed in those arches, how your eye is drawn up by the arms with, and also by light, creating those geometric patterns. So music had similar ways that composers would have this rationality and balance, in that there was a lot of structure in that emotion that the music was portraying. So the way this works in the classical period is, and for music, is that musical form became really popular. Things like sonata form or theme and variation. And basically what that was is composers would have music start in one key, move to different keys with different themes, but then to have that idea of balance, everything would end in that same key that it began. So if you're doing a piece, if you know music at all, if you start in C major, you might then go to G major or F or A minor, but then you would end up back in C major with all the same themes that were presented before. So this is across all music in the classical period, whether it's a symphony, piano sonata, an overture to an opera. An entire opera always had this idea of balance and structure. And the symphony also became very popular during this time period. It wasn't really a thing in the previous era, the Baroque era. There just weren't as many instruments around. So the symphony becomes a big, the main form of orchestral music that a composer can write, and became central in concerts that you'd see. And as far as opera goes, you get a really distinct line between recitative and aria. These are two forms and structures that we use to create opera. So recitative is what's known as sung dialogue. So the way it sounds is it's more chattery. You'll hear a lot of language happening. It will sound more like a conversation with very light orchestration underneath. So if it's secco, recitative, which means dry, that'll only be accompanied by harpsichord, mainly just to keep the singer in a key. We also have accompagnato, recitative, or accompanied, which is, of course, accompanied by the entire orchestra. That often precedes an aria. It's more emotional, but is still moving that plot forward. And then this is what makes opera and music theater, I would say, a wonderful thing, is that we get the opportunity to reflect on those emotions that that plot is taking us through. So if it's a solo singer, they're singing an aria, or you have duets for two people, trios for three, so on and so forth. And in these arias and ensembles, we reflect on whatever emotion, on the heartbreak that we've experienced from that conversation about so-and-so leaving, or joy, whatever that emotion is. In the classical period, these were very distinct lines. In fact, they're numbered in the sense, if you open a score, it would say recitative number 7, aria number 8, followed by recitative number 9. So it has this kind of start and stop. This is also during the time when people would go to the opera and it was more like watching a football game or a baseball game, where they wouldn't sit in darkness like this and sit in silence and watch like you would at a movie theater. Instead, they were going and they were chattering with each other. They were enjoying the time out. The lights were up. And there were a few reasons for this. And number one was that this was a time when freedom of speech did not exist. So if you were overheard saying something negative about your ruler, you would be tried with treason. And worst case scenario, that was a death sentence, of course. So the opera, there's a lot of noise happening during the opera. So you can gossip with your neighbor and not be overheard. But of course, this was also a time to go court, to show that you were part of the aristocracy, that you belonged in society, and to be entertained. Many of these operas were written for a wedding, for someone's name day, and often there was a ruler in attendance watching that opera. So if you were invited to see it as well, you were part of the upper crust for sure. As also, in the early days of opera, there was quite a bit of censorship happening. So the famous story there is with Mozart's Marriage of Figaro, which is based on one of the Beaumarchais plays, Le Mariage de Figaro, which was banned in many countries because of the conflict between the classes that that play focuses on. And this was right before the French Revolution, and the aristocrats could feel this tension between the upper and lower classes, and they did not want to give anyone any ideas in the theater. So when Mozart and Da Ponte wanted to write this as an opera, in order to make that happen, in order to get past the censorship, they changed the story and changed some of the words so that it focused more on love and the relationships there versus the class structure. So Figaro, for instance, in the play, has a monologue where he talks about how it's unfair that he has the position that he has just because of how he was born. He's like, why am I this and not a count? Because of how I'm born. In the opera, they change it to be where he turns to the men in the audience and says, the women around you are crazy, right? Which, again, now has its own problems, which we'll talk about later. But at least it allowed them to do the opera during the time period. So that brings us to one of my favorite composers ever, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He was an incredible person, a wonderful composer, wrote tons of great music. And what's so special about him is we know a lot about him because he wrote lots of letters during his lifetime to his father, to his wife, his mother, his cousin. And in these letters, we learn so much about his compositional style. He wrote quite a bit about the opera Idomeneo, for instance. And we learn he's going back and forth writing to his father, Leopold, and explaining Idomeneo was an aging tenor at that point. And so there was some music that wasn't really working for him. So we see in Mozart's thought process of how he's writing to make this work for this tenor. And also he would write all kinds of potty humor in his letters and jokes and in code. And so we learned that he was a jokester and a prankster and a real person. It's so great that we can have this full, well-rounded idea of who he was. And you can find his letters in a music library, I believe online, if you ever want to read a few of them. They're fascinating. So he was a child prodigy. He started writing music when he was about 5 years old, which is amazing. His first opera he wrote when he was 11. I don't know what you were doing when you were 11. I was not writing opera. I was figuring out how to be a human, like many of us are. And he wrote over 20 operas in his short lifetime. He was only 35 when he died, but even so, was an incredibly prolific composer. He wrote all different kinds of operas. He wrote opera seria, which is tragic opera, opera buffa, which is comedy, Singspiel, opera dramatiques, and outside of opera, he also wrote symphonies, piano sonatas, string quartets, concertos, all kinds of music. He was just constantly churning out this music. I mentioned his father, Leopold. Part of his success, especially from a young age, is Leopold was also a musician and a composer and noticed this talent in Wolfgang in this young age. So he was taking him to the best of the best. Mozart met Haydn, who was also a prominent composer during that time period. They went and toured around Italy and other parts of Europe. So this was almost from the moment of Mozart's birth, his life of just touring around, composing, performing, and churning out piece after piece. He, I mentioned, died at 35. Have any of you have seen the movie or play Amadeus? Yes, right. It's great because when I say that to people my age or younger, sometimes they're like, "I'm a what?" But it's a wonderful movie. Of course, that focuses mostly on his death and the mystery around that. The play and movie speculate that he was maybe murdered by Salieri because he was so good and he was so jealous about how great he was at composing. And historians think, well, as great as the stories that would make, probably didn't happen. We still are not really sure why Mozart died or what he died of, but the most likely thing is that he got sick and just wasn't able to get better. They didn't have medicine to help, but he was composing up until the day that he died. His Requiem, he wrote about half of, and the version that's performed these days was completed by his student Süssmayr. So you have some bits that Mozart wrote, and you get to, in Amadeus, there's that great scene where he's dictating, writing the Confutatis, but it's a fabulous piece. I love the Requiem. And like I said, he wrote a wide variety of operas, and he also had lots of advancements in what opera was in the classical period. Up until that point, the prominent genre of opera was opera seria, which I mentioned was tragic opera. It tended to have this set plot where there would be one ruler and then a set of lovers who for some reason couldn't be together, and over the course of whatever happens in the opera, that ruler self-sacrifices so those lovers can be united. So even though it's tragedy, it still ends happily for those lovers, and this was very much intentional because I mentioned that ruler was watching, and the composer and the librettist would know that their lord or duke or king or queen would be watching this opera, and they wanted them to feel really good about themselves. And so they'd hold up this mirror and say, "Hey, look at how selfless this person is being. I know you would be just as selfless if you were put in this situation." And when opera seria was really popular, opera buffa, or comic opera, served as the in-between entertainment. So as in between the acts of the opera seria, there would be this comic opera that was a filler piece as people were refilling their wine or chatting amongst themselves. And during the classical period, opera buffa becomes its own genre. It is no longer filler. There are full operas. Mozart wrote many comedies that stand on their own as their own pieces of work. And Mozart was able to come up with the idea of the ensemble finale, which is an incredible comedic device. He mentions it in Amadeus, that part when he's writing Marriage of Figaro, and he says there's 20 minutes of no recitative, everything just keeps going. And that's what ensemble finale is. Halfway through the opera, the end of Act 2, the characters will enter one by one, each bringing in a different piece of plot or conflict, so that by the time the curtain comes down for intermission, all of the principals are on stage and it's utter chaos. No one knows what's happening. It's a great cliffhanger, great comedic idea. And of course, there's no recitative. It's just through composed music, which is incredible. And the best example is in Marriage of Figaro. It's about 20 minutes long, but it is hilarious. For me, what really makes Mozart special is two things. One, he had this way of bringing characters from either opera seria or opera buffa and putting them into one opera together, so that instead of having these two-dimensional just comic or just serious characters, we're hearing music that you would associate with those operas all in one place, and people who are more serious, people who are more comic in the same story. So he would juxtapose these characters in his pieces. But more importantly, he had this gift of humanizing these characters through truly beautiful music. Opera, I love opera, but oh my goodness, do we have silly things that happen in them, and it's silly, kind of unbelievable things that happen. And Mozart was able to make us believe this emotion that the character is feeling by his gift of writing such wonderful music. So the example I wanted to give today of that is the wonderful aria Ach ich fühl's, sung by Veronique, played by Jen, and she's going to tell you a little bit more about what's happening in this aria. So come on up, you guys.
Hi everyone, I'm Veronique. I'm playing Pamina in 2 of the performances of the Magic Flute. And this aria, Ach ich fühl's, is a great example of those like high emotion moments where we get to see like a little crystal, all the facets of that little emotion in a drawn out period of time. So in this moment, it's in Act 2, Pamina has been captured and taken away from her mother. The queen is the knight who does the you guys know that probably. And she's in the Temple of Intelligence and Wisdom, which is Zoroaster's kingdom. And Tamino, the prince who she has fallen in love with and who has fallen in love with her, has fallen in love with her, is going through a series of trials and tests to make him a wiser and just king, which he will one day be. And one of the tests is that he can't speak to Pamina, but she doesn't know this. And so she comes in, and this person who she's put all her hope on in escaping this temple will no longer acknowledge her and will not look at her. And you feel the devastation. This is her last chance to get out, and this is a person that she loves. So in this aria, one thing that I love about it is it's quite evocative of where she's actually at emotionally. Like, the lines are long and elegant, which is what you expect in the classical period. But if you listen to what Jen's doing, it's a heartbeat underneath. It's very stark, it's very empty. And it's that feeling of being all alone. And you'll hear it as she plays it. And then later in the aria, when she's trying to pull out the emotional stops on Tamino to make him turn around and talk to her, you'll hear a little bit of what the queen does, these staccato gestures that you can hear she's related to this emotional, powerful being. So enjoy.
so beautiful, right? It's just some of the most gorgeous music. Mozart just knew how to do that. So here we are talking now more specifically about the Magic Flute. Like I said, one of my absolute favorite operas. I was fortunate enough to be in this twice, now with 3 times now with the school tour, third lady in this show, and it never ceases to be amazing every time. This was the last opera that Mozart wrote before he died. It premiered in Vienna on September 30th, 1791. And just a few months later in December is when Mozart passed away. So work it right up until the end there. It was an immediate success and has remained a success since it premiered hundreds of years ago. Of the Mozart operas, I would say this one and Marriage of Figaro are probably the 2 most popular and most often performed. Just really special pieces. It had the libretto, that's the word we use for the story, and the words was written by Emanuel Schikaneder. He was an actor as well and played the role of Papageno in the premiere. So this is an example then of one of the more comic characters. We'll get to hear from him in a little bit, but because Schikaneder's real gift was comedy and acting, his music is not quite as virtuosic, though he has a lot of arias. I think he sings 4 in the opera. But his music is much lighter, a little bit easier of a sing than, say, Archifus that we heard Pamina sing, who's one of the more seria characters in this story. It's also an incredibly good first opera, partly because the whole thing begins with a prince getting chased down by a dragon. I mean, you don't get more dramatic than that. And the images that I have up here are from the last time Arizona Opera did Magic Flute, and this is going to be the same production that we're going to do. Same costume, same set, different singers and actors, of course, and a different director. So the staging might not be the same, but you'll get to see that dragon come back again. Funny story, when we did it at Arizona State University during my doctorate, I believe the dragon we used was the dragon from Shrek. So had a little bit different feel when she came out batting her eyelashes at us, but it was still it was so great. Oh my goodness. But it's not only has lots of magic, but the themes of good versus evil, of going on a quest, of traveling. It's just kind of a classic story and really captivating music that is recognizable. The Queen of the Night's second act aria, which Veronique mentioned, the ha 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 ha, is really famous, and I'm sure you would recognize it if you heard it. And like I said, this is a great example of how Mozart juxtaposes the seria and buffa characters. So there are many characters in this story that kind of start in the wrong place and then end up in the right place. And there's a whole mix of who's a little more serious, who's a little more comical. So the 3 ladies, they're more comical, though they end up being kind of serious. And Papageno is more comical, as well as Papagena. And then there's Tamino, our prince, and Pamina, the princess, our lovers who find each other through this quest. There's the Queen of the Night, our villain. She's more seria, as is Zarastro, the king, the sun god, or sun king, I should say. Pamina's aria Archifus, you heard just a few minutes ago, and at the end of that aria, she talks about that she is going to die if Tamino doesn't reciprocate, doesn't turn and look at her and speak with her. So it becomes, and later in the story, she does try to kill herself. So you have that in your ear, and I wanted to show for you a little bit of Papageno's suicide aria, because at the end of the opera, he also sings about how if he doesn't find his Papagena, he's going to kill himself, but it's a little different. So this is Nathan Gunn singing this in the Met's version of Magic Flute, which they do in English. So I'll be able to hear him sing in English.
Papagena, Papagena, Papagena. Sing, darling little Muppet, forever. Guess I was never meant to have her. By chattering, chattering, I lost my chance. So that's the end of my romance. That's the end of my romance. I will decorate this tree with a hanging corpse of me. I'm sorry I was born. Tell the pretty girls to mourn. Everyone wants to mistreat me. There's no little wife to greet me. So this is it. It's time to die. Lovely lady, say goodbye. Lovely lady, say goodbye.
So a little different, huh? Yeah. So, like I said, this is at the end of the opera. Papageno has gone through the entire opera singing about how he wants to find his Papagena. He is going through the trials with Tamino and not doing very well because he has a hard time not talking. He has a hard time not eating good food and drinking. So in this aria, he even at one point, the fourth wall breaks and he's talking to the audience and says, hey, maybe if someone tells me not to do it, then I won't kill myself. So he asks them, I'm going to count to 3, and if I hear someone say, then I won't. And no one usually responds because we all get that the story has to go on. And he is eventually saved and rescued by the 3 spirits, and his Papagena shows up, and all ends happily. But this very serious emotion that he's experiencing is set to this really light music, which is really fun, and he has that happy way of dealing with this very difficult feeling that he has. So I also want to say too, Magic Flute is an example of Singspiel. This was a comic opera in Germany, and in Germany they had real difficulty setting German text to recitative because of the way that the language felt and the natural rhythm of the language. Composers had a hard time with that. So rather than having sung recitative in German comic opera, there is spoken dialogue instead. So in Magic Flute, there is no recitative, there is spoken dialogue. And what is most often done, what Arizona Opera is going to do, is have that dialogue in English so that all the Americans and native English speakers don't have to worry about trying to memorize dialogue in German, which is really hard. So they will do that in English, but sing the arias and ensembles in German, because that's a little easier of a sing. Like I said, the Met, and that's a family version that they do of Magic Flute, they wanted everything in English to make it as accessible as possible, and it's a really cool production. It's directed by Julie Taymor and has all kinds of puppets, and it's really fun. Yes. So I mentioned that Mozart was a bit of a jokester and a prankster, and my favorite story about that is that he played a joke on Schickenator during one of the performances. Schickenator was performing the role of Papageno, and at one point in the story, Papageno was gifted with these magic bells that help guide him on his quest, and Tamino is also gifted with a magic flute, hence the name of the opera. And at one point, there's an aria that Papageno sings where he plays his bells, and usually the actor makes it look like he's playing the bells, but somebody in the orchestra is actually playing them. And that night, Mozart decided that instead of conducting, he wanted to play the Glockenspiel off stage. But being the jokester that he is, he purposefully played it at the wrong time. So Papageno would be singing and either go to make the bells go and nothing would happen, or he'd be singing and there the bells would go of their own accord, making them truly look like magic bells. And Schickenator, being the great actor that he was, made an improv bit out of it, and at one point turned to his bells and said, "What are you doing? Play what I ask you to play." So just a little fun tidbit of the kind of person that Mozart was. He just sounds like a real hoot. I just love it. Both Mozart and Schickenator were also Freemasons, which was a common thing during the 18th century. There were many famous men who were Freemasons and part of Masonry. So, for instance, Voltaire, Goethe, as well as Haydn also were all Freemasons. So this was a society that was very secret, only for men. Women were not allowed to join. And Magic Flute is the only opera that Mozart wrote that has lots of imagery in it that is Masonic imagery. So you can have a real fun time going through and seeing how many images can you find. The overarching idea of good versus evil in this quest, going from darkness into lightness, or going into enlightenment, as it were, is absolutely a Masonic idea. At one point, the trials that we were talking about, that Tamino and Papageno go through, also, and then eventually Tamino and Pamina go through at the end of Act 2, are, we believe, reminiscent of the kind of initiations that people would go through to be Masons. But the biggest thing that you can look for is how many times the number 3 appears in the story. So I have up here the photos of the 3 ladies who are the ladies in waiting for the Queen of the Night. They don't have names, they're just the 3 ladies. And then next to them are the 3 spirits who are the Queen and, the ladies give to Tamino and Papageno to guide them over to Zarastro in order to rescue Pamina from him. And so there's a 3. 3 appears a lot in the music. Veronique mentioned that heartbeat that happens in the orchestra, but it's also a 3, right? Bum, 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 and then she sings. The overarching key of the opera is E flat major, which has 3 flats. And Mozart really believed in the power of keys and the emotional power of keys. So he purposefully picked E flat major because to him, this was a very regal, royal key. Of course, this story deals with a lot of royalty. We have the Queen of the Night, Zarastro, who's the king of the sun. You have Tamino, who is a prince, Pamina, who is a princess. But there's also the idea of from the Masons, they were thinking of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. That's kind of royalty and regality. So I wanted to give the overture is an excellent example of these 3s. It begins with these 3 chords, and Mozart will also take a musical idea and tend to repeat it 3 times in the course of the overture. So we could give that a little bit of a listen. One thematic idea he does once. He'll do it again in minor. And a third time where he'll resolve it. So that's, first of all, that overture is just so fun. With the way I mentioned the dragon comes in the beginning, Tamino is being traced by the dragon, and the 3 ladies rescue him from it. And so we're all set off stage when that's happening, and all of us would always be dancing backstage, looking across the stage at each other. It's every production I've done, that always happens because it's so catchy. But it also shows Mozart's brilliance. He does repeat things 3 times, but he doesn't do it the same way, right? He has it this way, and then he does it in minor, and then he changes it a bit. So if you're not, really paying attention to it, you might not notice, oh, he did this 3 times. But it's something to listen for. How many times? If he repeats something, or if he has a musical idea, does it have 3 parts to it? He's really brilliant with that. So Of course, we can't talk about a piece written in the 18th century without it having a few problems, right? Because thank goodness it is not like the 1790s anymore. We are a different time and age. So when we're looking at these wonderful pieces that are hundreds of years old, they do often have problems that we do have to talk about as a modern audience or a modern cast in modern lectures like this. So with this piece in particular, there is some kind of disturbing, misogynistic themes going through, as well as some racist themes as well. So the big premise of the story is, right, I mentioned there's the Queen of the Night, and she Tamino and Papageno meet her, and she tells Tamino in the beginning, hey, my daughter has been kidnapped by Zarastro, please go rescue her, go on this quest. So we think that she is this wonderful person, and then plot twist, halfway through, turns out, ooh, just kidding. She was lying. She is actually evil, and Zarastro is good. And Mozart he gives some hints to her evilness by the way he composes her. He has her sing lots of very high coloratura, which is a technique that he uses in other operas to show madness in a character. And Zarastro, by comparison, is the lowest singer in the opera. In fact, the Queen of the Night has a famous high F that she sings, and Zarastro, his lowest note is a low F. So there's lots of juxtapositions as well to look for. But when Tamino goes to Zarastro and says, I'm confused, I was told that you were this evil man who kidnapped Pamina, and I've come to rescue her, Zarastro looks at Tamino and says, well, what did you expect? The queen is a woman. Of course she's going to lie. Right, so, yeah, okay, can't really say that now, right? So when we do Magic Flute today, oftentimes what happens is either, like at the Met, they choose to just do it in English, so you don't even have to worry about the German, and they just cut that. They have him sing something else. Oftentimes what will happen is, even if they're singing in the German, the translation will be different, and the cast will have a conversation about how, hey, it's not the fact that she's a woman that makes her evil, she's just deceitful and evil, which is how it can be. And even so, not all of the women in the story are evil. The queen and the ladies are, in fact, and they try to take Tamino and Papageno off their course. But Pamina, of course, is just a symbol of goodness and innocence. Papagena is wonderful as well. She's comic and clever, and she's able to trick Papageno. And so even during this time period, Mozart does have this way of writing very strong female characters in many of his operas. A great example is Susanna and the Countess in Marriage of Figaro, as well as the women in Don Giovanni are also very strong. So whether or not Mozart was kind of a feminist before his day, it's hard to say, but this is a common theme that he does. So of course, we change that with translation. And the other problem that we have is with the character of Monostatos, who I haven't talked about yet. He's another one who starts in the wrong spot. He works for Zarastro and is there holding Pamina captive, but he is not a very good person. He ends up then in league with the queen and with the ladies at the very end of the opera. But in the original version, he was a Moor, and he sings an aria about the fact that he is unlovable and evil because he is black, which of course, can't do that today, right? Not true today or then. So instead, what people do, I put up a photo here of Monostatos, is oftentimes in the opera, instead of him being a Moor, he's just not human. So here he has some ears up here and horns, so maybe he's kind of like half goat. Sometimes he looks like an ogre. So then when he's singing that aria, it's more that he's just not human, and that's what's making him be the way that he is. So like I said, this is a conversation that is ongoing. When we're dealing with works that are hundreds of years old, it's worth knowing that they were written during a different time, thank goodness, that we have since progressed, right? And so we have this conversation of, is it worth doing these pieces? And I would say absolutely, because the music is stunning. The heart of the story and the message is still the same, that we're wanting good to triumph over evil, whether that has to be lightness triumphing over darkness, maybe not so much, but the theme of goodness and being where you're supposed to be and following your heart, those are all things that are human and that people were thinking of then that we still think of now. So what we do is we update these pieces so that they work in today and translate as needed and change words as needed, and that's how we're able to keep these beautiful pieces alive. So I wanted to end with an awesome clip from one of my favorite movies, The Shawshank Redemption. It takes place in a prison, and in this particular scene, the main character pulls out a record of a duet that he plays for the inmates over the intercom, and it just so happens that the duet that he chooses is a duet written by Mozart, not from the Magic Flute. It's from the Marriage of Figaro. It's called Sull'aria, but it just so captures the power of music and the power of opera. So I'll let that scene speak for itself.
Anne, did you hear that?
I have no idea to this day what those two Italian ladies were singing about. Truth is, I don't want to know. Some things are best left unsaid. I like to think they were singing about something so beautiful it can't be expressed in words and makes your heart ache because of it. I tell you, those voices soared. Higher and farther than anybody in a great place dares to dream. It was like some beautiful bird flapped into our drab little cage and made those walls dissolve away. And for the briefest of moments, every last man at Shawshank felt free. It pissed the warden off something awful.
Open the door. Open it up! Dufresne, open this door! Turn that off! I am warning you, Dufresne, turn that off!
You're mine now.
Andy got 2 weeks in the hole for that little stunt.
On your feet.
And that is all I have for you all. I will take any questions or comments if you have them. Anything at all? Yeah, over here.
It's not a question. It's
Yeah.
just,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, exactly. Well, especially, right, because that's also the foundation of the story is that you have the queen of the night, and Zarastro is part of the day, right? And so this going from darkness to lightness is a theme in the opera, but absolutely, that darkness does not necessarily have to be bad, right? How beautiful is the night sky at night? So exactly, it's good versus evil, I would say. Yeah.
Enjoyed your discussion here and ask for a short commentary on your part. Thinking about what you described, how does that relate to today's hip hop music?
What a great, yeah. How does it relate to today's hip hop music? Well, it relates in the sense that I think music is always expression of emotion. All art is that. Whether you choose to paint it or dance it or act it or sing it or play it, every culture has this way of expressing. So hip hop, of course, stems from a different place. Classical music is from Western culture, from Western aristocracy. Hip hop is more from African culture and from the rhythms and the dance that they feel, but it's also emotional expression. And I will say I am a lover of all music. I unashamedly listen to the top 40 on the radio and sing along with it. And I'm a huge fan of Hamilton, which is a hip hop musical. And I know rap in particular is another incredible way of expressing emotion and what that community is feeling as well. So that's my take on it. I love it all. Yeah.
So you talked about the misogyny and the racism. Mm-hmm. Do all the different companies use the same sort of way to, like, have you standardized how you change it out?
Oh, great question.
Or does each opera company decide how they want to do it?
Great. Yeah, the question was, has it been standardized how we deal with the misogyny and racism? I would say some things are in the sense that it's kind of universal that Monostatos, first of all, we don't do blackface anymore, of course, right? So in not only Magic Flute, but also in things like Othello, or when I was in Madame Butterfly, instead of wearing geisha makeup, we just were people in geisha costume. So that I would say is more universal, but usually it's a specific choice of how the director and the production team decide that they want to address it, as far as, are they using a different translation? What kind of conversation are they having with the cast? The other piece by Mozart that's pretty problematic, which we talked about last year, was Così fan tutte, which literally translates to women are like that. And it's about how women are always going to be unfaithful. And that was an entire production team of women, which was really cool. The director, the conductor, the set designer, the costume designer, the lighting designer. So there was a lot of conversations about the misogyny in that piece and how they wanted to deal with that. That one, for instance, too, has an ending that's kind of open-ended. We're not sure which couple ends up with who. So that can depend on what the director wants to do with that and what the cast wants to do with that. Great question. Anything else? Yeah.
So one more.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't realize that Mozart wrote the music and then Papageno wrote
Mm-hmm.
the libretto. So
Yeah.
did one write it first, or did they just collaborate?
Oh, good question. Yeah. Does the libretto or the music come first? I believe, or do they collaborate? I believe it's a little bit of a collaboration in the sense I think it's easier to set music to text than it is text to music. So oftentimes the words will come first, but it was they both collectively knew it wasn't like, you know, Mozart was mailed these words and said, hey, set it to music. So they wrote it together. It's for sure a collaboration. Things like oratorio music, for instance, his Requiem is set to a mass. So that is a set text, the Latin text of like the Kyrie, the Credo, well, yes, there is a Kyrie in that. So that is text that Mozart would have already had, and he gets to decide how to write it. And he wrote several masses, so it's interesting to see the different Kyries that Mozart wrote. Over here. Mm-hmm.
What are the dates of the performance?
Oh, thank you. I was supposed to say that. Thank you. Yes, so the performances are April 7th through 9th. And if you want to see Veronique sing, she is performing on April 8th at 7:30 p.m. That's going to be downtown at Symphony Hall in Phoenix, and then it will be the following weekend in Tucson. Any other questions? Making sure I'm not missing anyone. Great. Well, thank you all so much again for coming out. Hope to see you next